The heavy scent of metallic blood and expensive santal, 33 hit Zuri before the front door of the Seoul estate even clicked shut. Sungmin was home early. Zuri didn't look up. She didn't have to. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who owned the ground he walked on. She kept her head bowed, her focus intense on the marble floor she was polishing, praying her braided bun and the high collar of her uniform would hide the blooming violet stain on her cheek. But the footsteps stopped directly in front of her. "Look at me." The command wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. Zuri's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the cleaning cloth, her knuckles turning white. "I am nearly finished with the foyer, sir. I didn't expect." A cold, calloused hand suddenly gripped her chin. Sungmin tilted her head back with a sharp, possessive jerk. His eyes, usually as unreadable as black glass, flared with a sudden, terrifying heat. "Who touched you?" Zuri flinched, a reflexive movement that made his jaw tighten, so hard she heard the bone click. The silent reaper of the Dragon Syndicate was supposed to be a man of steel and silence, but as he stared at the handprints on her wrists and the raw bruise on her face, the air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. "It was a mistake, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was clumsy, I tripped." "You are a ghost in this house, Zuri," he murmured, his thumb grazing the edge of the bruise with a gentleness that was more frightening than his anger. "But even ghosts leave shadows, and someone stepped on yours." Before we begin, like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The Dragon Syndicate's estate was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and silence. Perched high above the neon-soaked arteries of Seoul, it felt less like a home and more like a cathedral dedicated to the god of order. For Zuri, the glass fortress was a sanctuary built on a single, unbreakable rule: do not be noticed. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., she moved through the vast, hollow rooms like a wisp of smoke. She knew the exact weight of the velvet curtains, the specific frequency of the humidifiers, and the precise angle at which the morning sun hit the polished obsidian of the dining table. She took pride in her invisibility. To be seen was to be an obstacle, and in Sungmin's world, obstacles were removed. Sungmin lived his life with the surgical precision of a clock. At 6:30 a.m., he would emerge from his master's suite, a silhouette of sharp lines and lethal intent. He never spoke to her. He didn't have to. Zuri would have his black coffee waiting, exactly 180 degrees F, placed on the left side of his tablet. She would be 3 rooms away by the time he pulled out his chair, hearing only the rhythmic asterisk tap-tap asterisk of his fingers against the glass. The routine was her armor. She studied the way he moved, the predatory grace in his step, the way he adjusted his cufflinks with a chilling, mechanical focus. He was the silent reaper, a man who could command a room without uttering a syllable. To the rest of the city, he was a myth of violence and power. To Zuri, he was a sequence of habits. She found a strange, twisted comfort in his predictability. If he remained a statue, she could remain a ghost. But lately, the fortress felt colder. The debt collector's phone calls were getting more frequent, their threats vibrating in her pocket even as she scrubbed the master bath. Every time a black sedan pulled into the driveway, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She worked harder, polished longer, and moved faster, trying to bury her fear under a layer of lemon oil and wax. She often watched him from the shadows of the mezzanine as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he controlled. He looked lonely, though she knew a man like him didn't believe in such human weaknesses. He was the king of a frozen empire, and she was the help. They were 2 planets orbiting in the same dark galaxy, never meant to collide. She believed that as long as she stayed in the shadows, the ghosts of her past could never find her here. She was safe behind his walls, protected by a man who didn't even know her name. Or so she thought, until the morning the routine finally broke. The air in the foyer remained heavy, the silence stretching until it felt like it might snap. Sungmin's hand didn't move from her chin. His fingers were a steady, terrifying anchor that forced Zuri to endure the full weight of his scrutiny. He didn't look like a man waiting for an answer. He looked like a man who already knew the answer was a lie and was simply deciding how to dismantle it. "You tripped," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't raise his tone, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He shifted his grip, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the bruise on her cheek, then moved down to her wrist. He pushed back the white lace of her cuff, exposing the dark, circular marks where blunt fingers had squeezed too hard. Do the floors in my house have fingers, Zuri? Do the stairs leave grip marks? Zuri tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. She looked at the tattoo on his neck, a dark, intricate rose that seemed to bloom against his skin as his pulse quickened. It's not your concern, sir. It's a private matter. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. It won't affect my work. Your work, Sungmin let out a short, humorless breath that ghosted over her skin. He leaned in closer, his shadow completely swallowing her. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating now, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of the world he had just come from. You think I care about the dust on the baseboards? Someone breached these walls. Someone laid hands on what belongs under my roof. I don't belong to you, she whispered, the spark of her old spirit flickering despite her terror. Sungmin's eyes narrowed, the black depths of his pupils narrowing into needle points. In this city, everything I see is mine, and I have been seeing you for a long time, Zuri. He released her chin, but he didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim, silver phone. He didn't look at the screen as he spoke. His eyes remained locked on hers. There are two ways this ends. You tell me the name of the man who did this, and I handle it quietly. Or I turn this city inside out until I find him. And if I have to find him myself, I won't be in a mood for mercy. Zuri looked at the floor, her eyes stinging. The debt collectors had promised to come back for her family if she spoke a word. They were monsters, but as she looked at the cold, clinical fury radiating from the man in front of her, she realized they were mere children compared to the Reaper. His name is Cho, she whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal of her own safety. He works for the Kims. It's a debt. My brother's debt. Sungmin went perfectly still. The name meant something to him, a ripple in the underworld he managed. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and began walking toward his study, the movement fluid and terrifyingly purposeful. Go to your room, Zuri, he called out over his shoulder, his voice as sharp as broken glass. And wash that makeup off. You don't need to hide anymore. I'm done looking at the fingerprints of a coward. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut, but the silence that followed was not the peaceful, quiet Zuri was used to. It was the pressurized stillness that precedes a storm. Inside the room, Sungmin stood behind his desk, his hands pressed flat against the dark wood. The name *Cho tasted like ash in his mouth. The Kims were a mid-level outfit, scavengers who grew fat on the interest of the desperate, but they were also a rival faction that had been testing the boundaries of the Dragon Syndicate's territory for months. By touching Zuri, they hadn't just collected a debt, they had committed an act of war. He opened a lacquered box on his desk, pulling out a burner phone and a ledger that listed the invisible threads of power in Seoul. To the world, Zuri was a maid, a girl from another continent with no standing. To Sungmin, she was the only thing in his glass fortress that felt real, the only warmth in a life made of cold steel. The realization that men like Cho had breathed the same air as her, had bruised the skin he had only ever dared to watch from a distance, ignited a cold, methodical rage in his chest. He made 3 calls. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke in the clipped, technical language of the underworld, ordering a complete freeze on the Kims' credit lines and the systematic surveillance of every collection office they operated. He wasn't just going to pay the debt, he was going to erase the ledger entirely. From her room down the hall, Zuri sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her heart hammering. She had scrubbed the makeup away as he'd ordered, leaving her face raw and the bruise exposed. She felt naked without her ghost mask. Through the thin walls, she heard the low rumble of Sungmin's voice, then the heavy tread of his boots as he left the study. Usually, his movements were predictable, but tonight the rhythm was jagged. A soft knock startled her. When she opened the door, Sungmin was standing there, his suit jacket gone, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal the tattoos snaking down his forearms. He held a small, silver tray with a bowl of ice and a silk cloth. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped into her small, modest space, his presence making the room feel microscopic. "The Kims are a smudge on the window, Zuri," he said, his voice surprisingly soft as he dipped the cloth into the ice. "And I have always been very particular about the view from my house." He reached out, his cool fingers steadying her chin once more. As he pressed the chilled silk to her cheek, Zuri realized with a jolt of terror and longing that the silent war had begun. Sungmin wasn't just protecting a maid. He was reclaiming something he had decided belonged to him, and he was willing to spill as much blood as necessary to keep it pristine. The following evening, the rigid architecture of the estate felt different. The air was charged with a tension that made the other staff members scuttle through the halls like frightened beetles. Zuri stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she adjusted her apron. She could feel the weight of their stares. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, hadn't looked her in the eye once, her mouth a thin, disapproving line as she polished silver with unnecessary force. The ghost had become a lightning rod, and the house was waiting for the strike. "He is waiting," Mrs. Park said, her voice tight. "In the dining room, not the kitchen nook, Zuri, the main table." Zuri's heart performed a slow, painful roll in her chest. The main dining table was a monolith of black marble that sat 12, a place reserved for syndicate lieutenants and blood-sealed contracts. She walked toward the room, her footsteps echoing too loudly on the hardwood. When she entered, the room was bathed in the amber glow of the city lights reflecting off the glass walls. Sungmin sat at the head, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Across from his usual seat, a single-place setting had been laid out, white porcelain against the dark stone. "Sit," he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a decree. Zuri remained frozen by the sideboard. "Sir, the staff. It isn't proper. I have work to finish in the laundry and Mrs. Park expects." "Mrs. Park expects to keep her position, which means she will expect whatever I tell her to," Sungmin interrupted, his voice a low, smooth velvet that brooked no argument. He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory, and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his heat radiating through her thin uniform. "The Kims believe you are a servant they can break. My men believe you are a shadow they can ignore. I am tired of both being wrong." He pulled out the heavy chair, the screech of metal on stone sounding like a herald's trumpets in the silent house. Zuri sat, her body stiff, feeling the immense vulnerability of being elevated to a height she hadn't asked for. As he sat back down and began to pour wine, a rich, dark red that looked like the lifeblood of the empire, he ran. Zuri looked toward the doorway. She saw the flicker of a shadow in the hall, the whispered hushes of the kitchen staff watching the impossible. The hierarchy that had kept her safe for 6 months was being dismantled in front of her eyes. Sungmin caught her gaze, his expression unreadable, though a spark of something possessive flickered in the depths of his eyes. By forcing her to eat at his table, he wasn't just offering her a meal, he was marking her. He was telling the world, and everyone inside these glass walls, that the maid was gone. In her place sat something the Silent Reaper intended to keep. 3 days later, a thick manila envelope sat on the obsidian dining table, looking stark and clinical against the luxury of the room. Sungmin stood by the window, his back to Zuri, watching the gray rain wash over the Seoul skyline. He didn't turn when she entered. He simply gestured toward the table with a flick of his fingers. "It is done," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The debt is settled. The interest, the principal, even the inconvenience fees your brother accrued. The ledger is burnt." Zuri stepped forward, her fingers hovering over the envelope. Inside, she found a series of notarized documents. A deed to her mother's apartment back home, a formal release of liability from the Kim's Shell Corporation, and a bank draft in her name that would take her years to earn as a maid. It was everything she had ever prayed for, a clean slate, a life where she no longer had to look over her shoulder. It was a gift of absolute safety. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice cracking with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I don't know how I can ever—" "Do not thank me yet," Sungmin interrupted, finally turning to face her. He walked toward her with that slow, rhythmic gait that usually made her feel protected, but today something was different. He reached out and placed a second, smaller stack of photographs on top of the documents. Zuri's stomach curdled as she looked at them. They weren't of papers or signatures. They were grainy, high-contrast shots of a dark alleyway. She saw Cho, the man who had bruised her face, slumped against a brick wall. He was alive, but his hands, the hands that had gripped her wrists, were swathed in heavy bandages, his face a distorted mask of pain and terror. "He will never hold a ledger again," Sungmin said, his eyes cold and dark, reflecting no regret. "Nor will he ever lay a finger on a woman. I made sure he understood that his life was a currency he had overspent." Zuri recoiled, the heavy paper slipping from her numb fingers. The clean life he was handing her was covered in invisible blood. She looked at the man she had begun to admire, the man who had treated her with a strange, silent tenderness at this very table, and realized the Silent Reaper wasn't a nickname, it was a promise. "You did this for me," she whispered, her heart racing not with love but with a sudden, sharp fear. "I did what was necessary to ensure you never flinch at a footstep again," he replied, stepping into her personal space. He reached out to touch her cheek, but for the first time, Zuri didn't lean into his hand. She stayed frozen, realizing that the walls of this glass fortress didn't just keep the world out, they kept a monster in. The safety he offered was a cage forged in violence, and the price of her freedom was knowing exactly what he was capable of. The silence of the glass fortress was shattered at 3:00 a.m. by a sound that didn't belong in a sanctuary, the rhythmic, muffled asterisk thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. Zuri was thrown from sleep not by the noise, but by the weight of a body pinning her to the mattress. She started to scream, her hand flying up to strike, but a large, familiar palm clamped over her mouth. The room was pitch black, saved only by the frantic sweep of red security lasers dancing across the ceiling. "Be silent," Sungmin's voice rasped in her ear. He wasn't wearing his suit or his silk robe. He was in tactical black, his skin smelling of cold rain and burnt ozone. "They are not here for the ledger. They are here for you." Before she could process the terror, he hauled her off the bed. A window in the hallway exploded, raining diamonds of tempered glass across the floor. Sungmin didn't flinch. He shoved Zuri into the narrow space of her wardrobe, his body acting as a shield. The Kims hadn't taken their defeat lying down. They had realized that the Silent Reaper finally had a pulse, a weakness that lived in the servants' quarters. "Stay down. Do not move until I come for you," he commanded. Through the slats of the wardrobe, Zuri watched the man she thought she knew disappear. A shadow detached itself from the doorway, a hitman in gray. Sungmin moved with a speed that defied human physics. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. He didn't use a gun. He used a combat knife that caught the red light of the security sensors like a streak of blood. The struggle was short, brutal, and terrifyingly quiet. When the intruder fell, Sungmin didn't even look at the body. He pivoted, his eyes scanning the darkness with the predatory focus of a dragon defending its hoard. More shadows swarmed the mezzanine. The estate, once a masterpiece of light and transparency, had become a kill box. Zuri pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the sounds of the dragon roaring. This wasn't the refined man who poured her wine. This was the monster who kept the city in a chokehold. He fought with a feral, possessive rage, clearing the hallway with a systematic violence that made her stomach turn. Every life he took was a grim payment for her safety. As the last of the intruders was neutralized and the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the carnage in a sickly yellow glow, Sungmin turned toward the wardrobe. His face was splattered with red, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and for a split second the Reaper's mask slipped, revealing a raw, agonizing fear that she might have been hurt. Zuri realized then that she was no longer just a maid or a ghost. She was the center of a war she never asked to fight, and the man standing in the blood was the only thing between her and the grave. The adrenaline that had turned the estate into a battlefield began to recede, leaving behind a cold, biting reality. The sirens in the distance were a low hum against the heavy silence of the master suite. Sungmin had carried Zuri away from the carnage of the servants' wing, refusing to let her feet touch the glass-strewn floor. He placed her on the edge of his own bed, the inner sanctum she had spent months cleaning but never dared to inhabit. Zuri was shaking, a deep, rhythmic tremor that started in her marrow and rattled her teeth. She stared at the floor, her eyes fixed on a small slice on her palm she hadn't realized she had taken. The red was stark against her skin, a reminder that even in a fortress she was fragile. Sungmin appeared before her, stripped of his tactical gear. He knelt on the floor between her knees, a position of such profound humility that Zuri's breath hitched. He held a first aid kit, but his hands, the hands that had just ended lives, were trembling. He reached for her injured hand, his touch so light it was almost a question. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words were so quiet she thought she might have imagined them. The silent reaper did not apologize, he dictated. He did not feel, he executed. But as he cleaned the small cut on her hand, a single hot drop hit her wrist, then another. Zuri looked down, her heart fracturing in her chest. Sungmin wasn't looking at her. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a silent, racking sob. The dragon was weeping. "I thought I lost you," he choked out, his voice thick and broken. "I have built a world of walls and shadows to keep everyone away, but you were the only light I let in. If they had taken you, there would be nothing left of me but the monster." For the first time, Zuri didn't see the mob boss or the protector. She saw a man who had been starving for a decade and had finally found something worth holding on to, only to realize his own hands were too bloodied to touch it. The fear she had felt in the wardrobe began to melt, replaced by a devastating ache. She reached out with her uninjured hand, her fingers trembling as she brushed the hair from his forehead. He leaned into her touch, a broken king seeking sanctuary. In that moment, the power dynamic of the estate inverted. He wasn't the master, and she wasn't the maid. They were simply two scarred souls in a room full of ghosts, realizing that the greatest danger wasn't the men outside the walls, but the love that was starting to take root in the wreckage. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the only things in the estate that still felt peaceful. The carnage of the night before had been scrubbed away by a cleanup crew that moved with the same clinical silence as the Reaper himself, but the smell of ozone and copper lingered in the vents. Zuri stood in the center of the master suite, her suitcase, a small, battered thing she had brought from the world outside, sitting by the door. Sungmin stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the city. He was back in a suit, the armor of his status firmly in place, but the vulnerability from the night before still hung in the air like an unspoken confession. He turned when he heard the click of her suitcase handle. "Where are you going?" he asked. The command was gone, replaced by a hollow resonance that made her chest ache. "The perimeter is doubled. You are safer here than anywhere in Seoul." "Am I?" Zuri asked, her voice steady despite the thrumming of her heart. She looked around the room, the marble, the silk, the glass. "You saved my life, Sungmin, you settled my debts. But I saw you last night. I saw what you do, what you are asterisk. I can't live in a fortress built on the bones of other people." Sungmin stepped toward her, his expression hardening. "I did those things for you. I cleared the path so you would never have to hide again." "But you didn't ask me if I wanted a path paved in blood," she countered. "You want to put a crown on my head and call me a queen, but in this world, a queen is just a target with a prettier cage. I don't want to be a mafia queen. Sungmin, I don't want to look at your hands and wonder whose life paid for my dinner." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sungmin reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he let it drop, as if remembering her flinch from the days before. "I cannot change who I am, Zuri. The syndicate is a dragon. If I let go of the reins, it devours everyone, including me." "Then let it," she whispered. "Or find a way to kill it, because I can't love a shadow and I won't be a ghost in a house of death anymore." She picked up her bag, the weight of it a grounding force. She saw the flash of agony in his eyes, the look of a man who had finally found the horizon only to realize he was blind. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, leaving the scent of lemon polish and a different kind of strength in her wake. She wasn't just leaving his house. She was rejecting the only protection he knew how to give, forcing him to choose between the empire he had built and the woman who had finally truly seen him. The following week, the atmosphere in the Dragon Syndicate shifted from a cold order to a frantic, vibrating heat. Sungmin did not go to the clubs or the docks. He stayed in his study, the doors locked, the air thick with the scent of burning paper and the ozone of high-end encryption servers. He was dismantling a kingdom, brick by blood-stained brick. He moved with the same surgical precision he had once used to expand his territory, but now he was severing the nerves. He transferred offshore accounts to anonymous trusts, signed over the shipping lanes to his second-in-command, and burned the ledgers that held the secrets of Seoul's elite. Every signature was a death warrant. Every deleted file was a bridge burned behind him. In the underworld, power is a debt that can never be fully repaid, and the syndicate did not let go of its head without a pound of flesh. Zuri stayed in a small, nondescript apartment in the city, the silence of her new life deafening compared to the fortress. She worked at a local bakery, her hands covered in flour instead of polish, trying to forget the weight of Sungmin's gaze. But every morning, a single white rose appeared on her doorstep. No note, no name, just a silent promise that he was still fighting his way out of the dark. Inside the estate, Sungmin faced his board of lieutenants. The air was thick with the threat of mutiny. They looked at him, their reaper, their king, and saw a man distracted by a ghost. "You are throwing away an empire for a maid." His oldest advisor spat, the sound of a pistol slide clicking in the back of the room. Sungmin didn't even reach for his weapon. He looked at the man with a hollow, terrifying calm. "I am not throwing it away. I am burning it so she never has to smell the smoke again." He gave them everything, the territory, the money, the influence, demanding only one thing in return, a clean exit and a vow that Zuri's name would never be spoken in their circles again. It was a gamble that relied on the very fear he had spent 15 years cultivating. He was trading his crown for her peace, knowing that the moment he stepped out of those glass walls, he would no longer be a god, but a man with a target on his back. As he walked out of the foyer for the last time, leaving the keys to the fortress on the obsidian table, he didn't look back. He had spent his life being a reaper of souls. Now, he was finally ready to be a man worthy of her sight. The rainy streets of Seoul felt narrow and claustrophobic as Sungmin walked toward the small bakery where Zuri worked. He was a man without his shadows, stripped of his guards and his armored cars. For the first time in a decade, he was vulnerable, and the city knew it. He was only a block away when the black sedan screeched onto the sidewalk, cutting off his path. 3 men stepped out, remnants of the Kim's faction who hadn't forgotten the blood he'd spilled. They didn't want territory. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the Reaper bleed out in the gutter. Sungmin stepped back, his hand reaching for the knife tucked into his waistband, but he was outnumbered and out in the open. A lead pipe swung, catching him across the ribs, and he went down on one knee, the breath hitching in his lungs. "Where is your empire now, Reaper?" One of the men sneered, drawing a serrated blade. From the doorway of the bakery, Zuri watched the man she loved collapse. The world seemed to slow, the fear that had dictated her life for years suddenly crystallizing into a sharp, cold clarity. She wasn't a ghost anymore, and she wasn't a maid waiting to be rescued. She was a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and survived. She didn't scream for help. Instead, she grabbed the heavy cast-iron flower pot from the bakery entrance and hurled it with a guttural cry of rage. It shattered against the back of the man holding the knife, sending him sprawling. Before the others could react, she was there, swinging a heavy industrial tray she had snatched from the counter. She didn't move with the grace of a trained assassin, but with the desperate, jagged strength of someone protecting their only reason to hope. She stood over Sungmin, her chest heaving, her apron stained with flour and the dirt from the street. She looked at the men who had once terrified her, and saw them for exactly what they were, small, cowardly thieves. "Get away from him," she snarled, her voice vibrating with a power that made even the attackers hesitate. In that moment of distraction, Sungmin found his footing. He didn't finish them with the coldness of a boss. He moved with the protective fury of a partner. Within seconds, the street was quiet again, the attackers fleeing into the dark. Sungmin leaned against the brick wall, blood trickling from his lip, staring at Zuri as if he were seeing a miracle. She dropped the metal tray, her hands finally beginning to shake. He reached out, not to claim her or to hide her, but to lean on her. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. "I told you," she said, her eyes fierce and bright. I'm done being a ghost. She wrapped his arm around her shoulder, her strength meeting his, proving that the debt was finally paid in full, not with money or blood, but with a choice to stand together. 3 years later, the morning air in the coastal town of Busan carried the scent of salt and cedar rather than the metallic tang of Seoul's underworld. In a bright, sun-drenched storefront overlooking the water, the bell above the door chimed, cutting through the quiet hum of a neighborhood waking up. Zuri stood behind the counter of the Glass Orchid, a boutique restoration and interior design firm that was entirely hers. She was no longer wearing the black and white uniform of a servant or the light-hiding makeup of a victim. She wore a vibrant, silk-wrapped dress that matched the warmth in her eyes, her hair styled in soft, natural curls that framed a face that had long since healed from the shadows. A man sat at the small bistro table in the corner, nursing a cup of tea. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the faded ink on his forearms, reminders of a past life that felt more like a fever dream now. Sungmin didn't look like a reaper anymore. The hard, mechanical edge of his posture had been replaced by a quiet, grounded contentment. He spent his days managing a legitimate maritime logistics company, but his mornings belonged to her. He didn't watch her from the mezzanine anymore. He sat in the light with her. "The shipment from Italy arrived," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "The marble you wanted for the library project." Zuri smiled, leaning over the counter to press a brief, lingering kiss to his forehead. "Thank you, and the audit for your company." "Clean," he replied, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Not a single shadow in the ledger. They had walked through fire to reach this stillness. The transition hadn't been easy. There were nights in the first year when every car backfire made them both reach for weapons that were no longer there, and months of legal battles to ensure their new life was built on solid rock. But they had done it together. As a group of local business owners walked in, greeting Zuri by name and asking for her professional opinion, Sungmin watched her with a pride that ran deeper than any empire he had ever commanded. She was the most visible person in the room, vibrant, successful, and completely free. The silent reaper and the ghost maid had vanished into the gray mists of Seoul. In their place were two people who finally knew the value of being seen. Zuri looked out the window at the sparkling ocean, her hand finding Sungmin's across the table. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding, she wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess, and she wasn't afraid. She was finally, irrevocably visible. Thanks for watching, and remember to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss interesting stories like this. See you in the next story.